Dear guests, you are welcomed to join us again this Saturday about the Silver Lining for Learning episode 27. We are very happy to be host this show. And we have Chris Didi from Harvard University, Kurt Bonk from Indiana University, me, Sean Ye Chen from East China Normal University. And we also have other three guests hiding there, but they will meet you at YouTube discussion board. They are Scott McNeil, University of Colorado, Denver, Yong Zhao from University of Kansas, and Punya Mitra from State University of Arizona. Today, we are discussing again, we are back to China. China is the first country has this COVID-19 breakout, but also I think this is the first country almost come out the first tide of the pandemic. And we are very happy to have three prestigious guests to join us and to share their insights and also their observations. The first, we will have Professor Chuang Wang, Dean of School of Education in Macau University, and Cody Abbey from this the Rural Education Action Program joint at the research joint, which is a collaborative research center at Stanford University. And he's also a manager of a new online program working with rural teachers. And also Mr. Oh Yangbing, the founder and the CEO of Lingyun Education. And he started his professional journalist and editor in the United States and China. And this Lingyun Education now is offering or providing teacher trainings in China, competing with those institutions. And so interestingly, Professor Chuang Wang stayed in Macau during the pandemic, am I right? And it has usually been ignored or not been very notified by audience or the people around the world. That is Macau as a special administrative region in China is also doing very well in dealing with COVID-19, and also the old schools at Macau also started or reopened successfully since September. So Professor Wang, what's your observations and insights about why Macau could do so well during this pandemic? Yeah, especially in education. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And first of all, I'm very happy to share my experiences with you today. It's a very good platform for us to communicate with each other. I think that we should all work together to go through this difficult time. I've been in Macau since last year, and I was stuck in Macau since January because we're not allowed to come out of Macau or come back to Macau since January. Still, I cannot move freely because I have a US passport. But if you have a Chinese passport, you can now enter into mainland China and come back. Or if you have a Macau resident, you can also come in and out of Macau freely. But if you have a foreign passport, you are still not allowed to come back to Macau. So that's why, even though I can travel to other places, but I will not be able to come back. That's why I'm still staying in Macau. Macau is a very small island. It only has 20 square kilometers, but it has a heavy population. It has 600,000 population. Macau is doing very well, as Shuang has explained, because the Macau government has taken very strict control. I think probably it's the most strict control in the world since the pandemic. As soon as Macau realized the COVID-19 pandemic, Macau closed its border. Macau is on an island, so as Shuang has introduced, the only connection between Macau in the world is either through Hong Kong or through mainland China. So Macau does not have international, it has international airport, but it's a very small airport. So whenever we travel to other countries, we have to go through Hong Kong, or we have to go to mainland China, we have to go to Zhuhai. So it's easier to control because they closed the two borders between Macau and Hong Kong and Macau and Zhuhai. And another thing that is we've been doing well is that Macau government was well prepared before the pandemic hit Macau. Macau's government has a lot of resources. So as soon as they know that the pandemic is coming, because it happened in mainland China first, Macau government sent a delegate to Portugal, because Macau used to be a colony of Portugal. So they have a very close relationship with Portuguese government. They sent a delegation to Portugal, and they purchased a lot of face masks and hand sanitizers. So Macau has never been out of resources. So the government has been issuing face masks and hand sanitizers to all of us with a very, very minimal cost. So everybody, for example, everybody can buy 5 face masks each week with like less than $1 for 8 face masks. So it's been very minimal cost. And also for the University of Macau, we turned into online teaching immediately after we heard of the pandemic. So we were not ready. Nobody was ready for the pandemic. But the university leadership decided to go to 100% virtual teaching immediately. So the university provided technical support to all teachers who need help. And also the university has taken measures for not allowing students to come back all at the same time. For example, first of all, we are now 100% face-to-face. So we started our regular sessions on September 7th. But before September 7th, in August, the university has gradually allowed students to come back. We have cohorts. Or first of all, they allowed doctoral students to come back, and then they allowed master students to come back, and then they allowed local undergrad students to come back, and then they allowed students in mainland China to come back. Still, international students in other places, like other countries, they are not still allowed to come back. But we accommodate their needs. If a professor has a student who is residing in other countries and not allowed to come back to Macau due to the visa issue, the professor has to provide both face-to-face sessions and online sessions to the students who cannot come back, even if you only have one student outside of Macau.
Dr. Wang, I have a question for you and a little comment. I've been to Macau, fascinating place, and Hong Kong, and the region, about 5 years ago.
Yes.
I noticed that you got an award, first place award from ACT for distance learning and what you've provided, and you're also interested in social presence and instructor presence and so forth. I'm wondering, given the changes that have taken place in China over the last 2 decades in terms of distance learning, and there have been quite a few, China at one point really sort of banned online and blended learning, except for a few select universities that could offer them. And I was a visitor to Beijing Normal many times. And they were one of the leaders in blended learning. So they have a chapter in a book I did on blended, but they mentioned that SARS was the major facilitator, what caused China to start embracing online and blended learning in 2003, 2004, 2005. Now, fast forward 15, 16, 17 years later, we have another pandemic. So there was a major change in the structure of education and in those universities and other entities that were engaging in online and blended learning. Do you see similar things happening today with this pandemic to what happened in opening things up? Are there things that still need to be more opened that weren't yet and that are going to change now? Because not only we have that first pandemic with SARS, we have a second pandemic, and often people's eyes open up by disasters, by, we're reactive creatures, human beings, we're not proactive. How are they reacting to now at this point make further changes in online and distance learning? Any of people, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Bang. It's a very good question. First of all, as I mentioned that before coming to Macau, I came to Macau last year. Before coming to Macau, I worked with quite a lot of colleagues in the US on online learning. And since I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education, before the pandemic, I already taught my staff to get ready for online teaching because I know the benefits of online teaching. I also know the possible resistance professors and students have against online learning. Unfortunately, nobody is willing to do that until they are forced to do it. And we are all, have no other options. So I have done online teaching too. So in the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, I developed an online course for hierarchical linear models. So it's a challenge. I know that the professor have to prepare a lot of materials, narrated PPTs and video clips, and also I summarize 3 key words for online teaching. I keep telling my colleagues. One thing is communication, because on face-to-face sessions, you meet the students daily, or not daily, or weekly. So you talk to them, even if they listen to you or not. On online teaching, if the professors don't reach out, the students will feel that they are lost. So I think communication is very important. So you should communicate with students all the time. And the second word I shared with my colleague is engagement. You have to help the students engage in the course. So that's also typical in online teaching, because you have to think about activities to get students engaged, to keep them interested in the learning. And the third word I shared with them is assessment. So you have to do constant formative assessment. So you have to make sure they are learning what they are supposed to learn. I agree that China is a little bit more prepared than the world because of the SARS, quite a long time ago. I don't remember, maybe at least 15 years ago. When China hit with SARS. Yes, because at that time I was still a student at Ohio State University, so I remember that was at least 15 or 16 years ago.
I was waving at you from Indiana at the time.
Yes, yes. Yes, but again, even in Macau, we have a learning center, like a CTEL, Center for Teaching and Learning. And I think every university has a learning center to provide technology support. And we have some people, and even in each faculty, we have technology person to help professors develop online courses. But again, the major task, major burden is on the professors. So especially professors who have been teaching for 20 or 30 years with face-to-face session, they are very reluctant to teach online. And we also have problems. We have some professors who just upload their PPTs to the Zoom or to the platform and didn't have much engagement or communication with the students. Students are complaining to say, I don't even know my professor. So that's why now we turn to 100% face-to-face now, because students have a lot of complaints about online teaching. But I'm in favor of online teaching. Of course, in this time, we have to come back to face-to-face because students are missing the classrooms, are missing each other, they miss their classmates. So, but in the future, I do think online teaching has a bright future, and all people, especially to meet the needs of the students. Students like the convenience, even synchronous or asynchronous. It's more convenient for students to take online courses than to take face-to-face courses.
Okay, Professor Wang, we will come back to you later. And now we move to Cody. And I know, Cody, you have actually worked in Shanxi, the west of China, for quite a long time. And so you know the rural part or the west part of China quite well. And although you are have been, you have to stay in the United States during the pandemic and you cannot go back to China, but I know you worked closely with your team there. So what would be your observations of China experience in pandemic and now reopening? So what's your observation and insights?
Yeah, thanks, Zhangye. And I want to start off by, like I was saying, I watched some previous episodes of your program, and I thought that it was really interesting. I think one of the professors here mentioned how marginalized people really need to have the same voice as other students. And I think in China, it's really easy to forget what a large portion of the population is rural in China. So from my perspective, although I'm not in China right now, I've been doing research and working with my team in a distance fashion to carry out a computer assisted learning program in rural areas. And I think there are a few things to kind of note about rural China. So first is what is the context of rural China pre-COVID-19? So before COVID-19 even happened, what were the differences between urban and rural China? And when I think of rural China, I'm talking more about Western and Central rural China. There are rural areas in Eastern China, but they tend to not be lagging as far behind as urban China in general. I think the second after that, I just want to kind of summarize like what happened during COVID-19 in rural China from what I've seen. And then post COVID-19, which has not been a very long period so far, but what I guess are some questions to think about post COVID-19 now that China has started their new semester in the fall. So, and feel free to ask any questions. I don't want to be too long-winded here, but I think, so for the context of China before COVID-19, right, 70% or over 2/3 of China's children are growing up in rural areas, and that's out of 230 million children. So that's a huge scale. And the severity of the gap is also quite large in between urban and rural China. So, and it's not really so much due to, especially when schools, it's not so much due to hardware. So like infrastructural desks and the overall physical infrastructure of schools, but rather software. They say it in Chinese, 软件. And that can mean a lot of different things. Those gaps between urban and rural students start really early. We find at REAP, so interactive parenting is a lot less in rural areas, nutrition is worse. But then to focus more on schooling, K through 12 school, that kind of is reflected in differences in teaching and the teaching quality. And I have great respect for rural teachers, and I've interacted with a lot of them over the last decade. I've been kind of involved with this, but it's been clearly shown many times that teaching quality, for reasons of less personalized learning, those teachers in rural areas, they're overworked, and they often have to teach multiple subjects. Sometimes they're not skilled at. Their English is very poor, which isn't good for students who need to take English exams. And I think very importantly as well is they have much less parental support than in urban areas. So rural parents, although there are some rural parents that do really emphasize education, I think a lot of parents think it's important, but they don't quite understand how they should provide for their kids in terms of education. And they often will not even be at home, because a lot of parents in rural China grow up they go work in urban areas as migrant workers. A vast majority of them do that. So for these reasons, there's a huge gap between urban and rural students. And a lot of the traditional solutions to this that you might think, oh, well, for instance, teacher training. Why don't you do teacher training? Well, China has tried teacher training for everywhere, but also in rural areas. But we found with our research at REAP that largely it hasn't been effective. So even their billions of RMB poured into their national teacher training program hasn't been effective. You also been hard to bring teachers to rural areas. So rural teachers who are master teachers or high level teachers very rarely will want to go. And even recent college graduates, at most, China has found that you can only get them to stay in rural areas for 1 year. And then kids often aren't able to go to better schools in urban areas because of different policy restrictions. So when you think about how in China, how education is such a positional good, and that if you want to achieve in society, it's largely tied to what university you go to, and your Gaokao score, that this is a big problem, right? And this was before COVID-19. So when you think about all of these, problems and the possible solutions haven't worked, educational technology, and I know you guys have talked about this in many different episodes and probably have many different possible solutions, and some of you guys have your own, proposals of how to use educational technology that I also read through some PDFs online, translated into Chinese. I think that was Professor Bonk here. But in China, it seems like educational technology has an opportunity. It's not necessarily a fix-all, but because all these prior solutions haven't worked, and because there's this need, and because there's this means, which is the means in China is that there's huge policy support for edtech. I'm not sure about other developing countries, but in China, there's been many different policies passed, maybe because of SARS, or maybe some other different reasons. But China has seen that edtech has promise. Also in rural schools, as I said, the infrastructure is a lot better than in most rural areas of different developing countries around the world. So I'm not saying every rural school is great, but it's the gap is much narrower than in other countries in terms of they have a lot of computer rooms. A lot of schools have computer rooms in China. I'd say over 75% have computer rooms, but a lot of them don't use it. And then also in China, there's this booming edtech sector. So China, I'd say, is comparable to the US in that regard. And Beijing has more edtech companies and startups than any other city in the world, even maybe compared to San Francisco. So
can I jump in?
Sure, definitely.
Okay. So edtech is not the innovation. Doesn't matter how much edtech you use. You can have terrible education that's saturated with edtech. Edtech is a catalyst, and it can be used to amplify teaching by telling and learning by listening and cramming information into people's minds for the Gaokao, or it can be used to help students become creators and develop global competencies that are going to be important in the next turbulent, disruptive half century, and so on. So, the degree of edtech is a catalyst, but it's not the answer. One of the themes on this program has been that the pandemic, which is a terrible human tragedy, offers a silver lining, which is that in every country, there's been some loss of centralized control. There's been some relaxation of compliance, and there's been the opportunity for bottom-up innovation. And in our first program on China, we talked about some of the bottom-up innovation that was occurring. Have you seen bottom-up innovation in rural education during the pandemic that would not have been possible before the pandemic? And do you feel that that's going to go away again now that China has more of a grasp on the pandemic than most countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I want to start by saying I definitely don't think that edtech, is a cure-all at all. And it does depend on how you use it. I was going to say eventually that a lot of edtech, honestly, we don't know what works and what doesn't work. And it also if you want to make that kind of a judgment, you need to know what your desired outcome is. And in China, a lot of that is revolving around how well you do in standardized tests. But there's also a lot of other aspects of education that are really important, such as social emotional learning and other aspects. So I'm definitely not denying that. But it does seem like there are these problems in China that haven't been able to be solved in other ways, regardless of whether it's, more social emotional aspects, or rather the more maybe surface learning or test oriented learning. So regarding COVID-19 in rural China, what we saw is before COVID-19, almost nobody was using edtech or technology at all. And as I said, the teaching was test oriented, and there also wasn't much personalized learning or teaching at the right level. So it doesn't matter what kind of aspect of education, it was always a big gap. Now during COVID-19, almost all students, so we did a survey comparing urban and rural areas, and in Henan province, so it's only one province, and it was only a few thousand students, but we found that 90% of rural students were using some sort of educational technology according to our survey. Well, that's a huge difference compared to almost probably less than a few percent before that. And what kind of methods were they using? Well, honestly, a lot of the methods they were using were following what their orders were of the Educational Bureau. So, and I think Shangye in an earlier episode, she talked a little bit about how it's very varied. There are different ways of doing it in different provinces. There's the Shanghai model where I think it's more blended, and then but in rural China, what we saw is it depends on the school. So some principals who are more innovative, they would try to do some different kinds of science experiments and have their kids at home do some science experiments and then send pictures to their teachers. But overall, what we found was, like in our overall surveys, because it's hard to talk about specific cases, quantitatively, we saw that much fewer students in rural areas were getting interaction with their teachers. And I think Principal Wang here, he also talked about that, about how important communication is. But we saw that on average, parents reported that their students were engaging in 1 hour of interaction with their teachers per week. And it depends on how you define interaction. But according to our survey, only an hour. So that wasn't very much compared to urban areas. I've talked to urban teachers. They say that the amount of interaction the kids are receiving was the same as during normal time. And that's impressive. That's one of the best schools in Xi'an she teaches at.
That's an important finding. It indicates a real need for self-directed learning skills and a lot of scaffolding in the more rural areas, which is what I'm studying. By the way, do you know Professor Paul Kim at Stanford? He was on one of our previous shows. And if you don't know him, you should look him up, or I can connect you to him. Do you know him?
That'd be great. I haven't met him, actually.
Okay, I'll do that after the show. I want to also say thanks for watching. Thanks for reading our blog posts. We're delighted that you could do a plug for us. That's great. And I have been to Beijing, and I went to the MOOCs Times building where the Silicon Valley of China is. And, they have gone from, in 1 year, 600 ed tech companies to 1,200. So I can verify some of the, that's 5 years ago. So, the ed tech scene is changing dramatically. But I'm more concerned about the pedagogy. And when you mentioned Shanghai offering blended approaches to to maybe the rural areas, I actually have a student doing a dissertation on online learning in the far western parts of China. And the educational delivery mechanism is video conferencing coming from Shanghai. So I'm wondering if you've seen that, and what are they doing professional development of teachers from the eastern part of China to the western edges of China? Is that the way that they're delivering education, or is that only part of the way? Can you explain what's happening there, and maybe your interpretation of what needs to happen? Anyone here, I think Shangye wants to, but first Cody, since you made a comment. Yeah.
Definitely. And from all different levels, you see this type of exchange between more developed areas and less developed areas happening. So from like a civil society perspective, like there's this one NGO called Qingxi Yuanshan, Qingxi Foundation, and they've been trying to, and also some other companies as well, but they've been trying to pair their best teachers up with a certain number of rural schools in the Western provinces. Now, from the government perspective, we see that in the latest, some of the latest policy documents from the Ministry of Education, there's this phrase, they want to change their 应急方案 to 精品课程. So they want to change their kind of emergency measures that they used during the previous pandemic to a more very high quality curriculum. And part of that, I think, is trying to pair top teachers in Beijing and Shanghai with rural counties. And I think honestly that was a plan before, but now I think the MOE in China has this renewed desire to do that, which is good because a lot of the schools on the school level, schools have been less innovative. I think they've been, trying to return to the normal, but not the new normal, but the old normal after COVID-19. But I think I see promising movement from the national government, at least, within policy to try to, experiment like China often does in a pilot way, a pilot method in different areas to see, does this kind of distance learning work?
But if China experiments with 70,000 or a million teachers at a time, we experiment with 100 or 150.
Yeah.
There's a little difference in experimentation.
Very true. Very true.
Shang-Yi, I think, wanted to comment on that, didn't you?
Yeah, but given time, I think we can move to Ouyang first, and then we can have a further discussion. Yeah. Actually, Ouyang is the founder of Lingyun Education and offering educational training, and that they have a close partnership also with the number 11 middle school in Beijing. This is a famous school, started their online solution very early, and also they also support those teachers in the rural part. And interestingly, Ouyang would also offer his comparative insights about this municipal level or this provincial level, because he could observe how the local governments, especially from the education, they are considering those pandemic measures, counter-pandemic measures, and also how what's their consideration underlying the reopening schools. Yeah, Ouyang.
Okay, pleasure to be here. And so, as Shang-Yi said, I founded a startup called Lingyun Education, which is really abnormal under the China's situation, because as all you know, like 90% of the China's education, we're talking about K-12, is public school, and of this teacher training is mainly by the normal universities or their own systems. So Lingyun is like a wildlife, provide kind of a different teacher training thing for China. Pretty much maybe 3 years ago, one night my mind got some problem, so I made this idea, say, hey, let's set up this company. So by far, we trained like close to 5,000 teachers from more than 700 schools. So I cannot say enough on behalf of China, which is too ambitious. But what I can say here, because I'm stuck in New York, I'm living in New York, so I can get some like a comparative perspective. So I would say now China, as all you know, everything's getting back to normal. Back to normal, which I mean, previously, as you discussed, say, the online education is maybe a chance, get more people accept this online education, which was true before. Let me give you an example. Say the pandemic happened in China between the January and February. Our first teacher training took place in March. So you can imagine how swift the Chinese teachers react the whole thing. So just within 1 or 2 months, they start their teacher training program online, which they never did before. Teacher training is not top priority for any schools, So, but they they keep thinking about this. They start thinking about their teacher training just about like a 1 or 2 months after the pandemic outbreak. So, and they move everything online. So I think this is pretty much one reason how China can handle this much better than other countries. Compared to New York, I pretty much know quite well about New York's education system as a parent. For public schools, they took them like at least 1 month to discuss whether or not they should close the school at the beginning of March. And even today, I don't think DOE has very clear idea what they're gonna do for the new semester. They pretty much, before they said, okay, we're gonna blend it, the education, in person and remote, and then they found out this won't work. So they switch another plan, but no clear plan to the parents. So I would say this is a quite clear case. Tell us, say, if you want to handle this, it's more like a, how, I know this is a new thing for everyone, but how you react the whole thing, it's really make a lot of difference. But this is related to another issue, say how hard you play with this whole pandemic. I mean, China is really play tough on this whole thing. They have pretty much like a zero tolerance policy. Even today, even though everything's going back to normal, even in Chinese classroom, the kids, they don't need to wear masks, only teachers. But they set up a very tough policy, say, any kids come with abnormal body temperature, the whole class will lock down quickly, soon, immediately. And they happened to a couple of times to my friend's school a couple of times. So they are quite serious. But I don't say that New York. But I think it's related to the, I don't even think this is a matter of educators. This is a matter of a government, it's a broader topic. So I would say this is another maybe lesson we can learn from. And the third lesson is technology. How open to the technology. I agree with Chris about like technology is only tool. And this is very complicated, but I will give you a case. Say, previously of this teacher training in China, our customers, education bureaus, schools, they never thought about online. Everything should be in person, on the ground. But this pandemic, since this pandemic, all of our teacher training all moved to online, and they suddenly realize, say, hey, online is good, online is cheaper and more effective, and it's the only way you can choose. So for example, we do the online even starting from this summer with Jack Ma Foundation. This is related to the rural education. So the Jack Ma Foundation only focus on the rural education. So we co-work with them, just trained around 40 rural teachers, new teachers. Everything's online. So as you may know, like China's infrastructure is really good. So our teachers are mainly based in the underdeveloped China, but everyone has a cell phone as 4G. And when we ask this teacher, say, hey, would you please open your video during the PD session? They open the video and they join the whole thing very actively. And sometimes you can say, yeah, they are brushing their teeth while we're teaching, and go out and buy breakfast. But they're doing this, they're getting used to this. So I would say that the pandemic is good training or teach for Chinese people, where I can only say the teachers, they be a little bit more open to online training or technology. But I cannot say for sure, say this would give us some like a deep change. Yeah.
So if I can ask, Was the content or the goals of the professional development different? Did you find that schools were asking that the teachers learn something different than they might have been learning face to face? Or is it really just shifting the same thing from face to face to online?
Yeah, good question. I would say same,
Okay.
because there's no difference. Um, Normally, I have to say honestly, I don't think the schools they have clear idea what the goal for teacher training. I mean, uh, what I want to say is they more like say, hey, you let me know what goal you can reach, or what difference you can bring to us. Or they have something pretty vague, say, hey, I want my new teachers be more ready, or I want my senior teachers be more involved, not burn out. A lot of them burn out, so they want to be, so they have some vague ideas, but they don't have a very specific ideas when they come to you. Yeah.
We have an audience question that's come up for anyone to answer. But Ben, if you want to go first on this one, how free do Chinese teachers feel to innovate? But that's a question for Ben first, but anyone can add to that.
How free do Chinese teachers feel to innovate? That's a very good question. Actually, you know what? Before I started Lingyun, I had no confidence to we can make any change deal with public school teachers, because they have been contained with a lot of pressure. 高考, but they also have 中考. So even for the elementary school teachers, they also have fight for the better middle school, the little 高考. So I didn't thought they can make any change. But the reason we continue to do the Lingyun in this 3 years, because I found out I was wrong. The reason is because when we try a lot of new ways to when we do the PD session with Chinese teachers, like say in our classroom, which is pretty much like American seminars. So people, the teachers sitting in the round tables, which make them so excited. They suddenly realize, say, hey, the teacher training is not a professor sitting at the stage and we all sitting another side like pupils. So suddenly they realize, say, hey, we can sit in groups, we can discuss with our partners, we can play games together, and we can try out PBL, project-based learning. And then they felt so they cannot get back. And Shuangye and I did a salon a couple months ago. It's a curriculum we incubate. A special education school in China co-work with elite high school students. So the teachers voluntarily spend like more than like hundreds of hours their own time to help their students to work on a project, PBL project. And then the teacher come to me. They're grade 12 teachers, they're suffering 高考 a lot. But they come back to me, say, when you try something really new and fresh, I cannot get used back to getting back to the normal teaching. So if we're talking about innovation, I would say how the supply matters. I would say whether or not you supply the Chinese teachers really new and high quality and usable things to them.
So we want to thank Anne for that question, and Scott's got a follow-up for that. And by the way, I was there at Gaokao Day 5 years ago. I was at Beijing Normal, supposed to get to the Open U of China, and I was an hour late because everyone was on the for exam day. It's crazy on the streets that day when they're in the morning. So Scott or someone in the audience, thank you, our audience. And you kind of answered the question actually in your response. What does innovation look like? And you talked about PBL and other things. What does innovation look like when you see online and blended learning, blended teaching taking place? from either a US context or a Chinese context, what kind of innovations are happening? And anyone could jump in on that.
Cody, yeah, do you have any concrete cases to share about the teachers' innovation? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what I've seen in most rural schools is that there are a subset of rural teachers that are really open to innovation. And I think if more rural teachers were able to attend training like Lingyun educations, it seems like they would also be really inspired. We have a bunch of different partners, like one's called Galuing, another one's called Xinxin, and they are all these NGOs in China that do these teacher training over the summer, and very unlike, I think, the national teacher training, which I think tends to be a little bit more theoretical and less easy for rural teachers to really feel inspired. I think these types of programs are what really can make them excited to be a teacher, because it's really hard to be a rural teacher in China. I think it's easy to forget that, and a lot of rural schools aren't getting enough teachers. They're overextended. Students are being moved into the county seats, and then those schools are getting crowded. And what we see is I think one interesting project was from Galuing, and they decided to inspire teachers to think of a solution themselves, like an innovative approach or a solution for their school that fits their local context. So every school is different and every learner is different. So if you really want to personalize learning, what might work in one school in Shanghai might not work in another school in Shanxi. And I think that was an interesting program. And I think teachers came up with all different possible solutions. So some teachers decided, oh yeah, maybe I'm going to use more project-based learning. Some other teachers looked a little bit more into different technology that they could use as a tool, which I think emphasizing that. And maybe it was through collaborating with a richer school in an urban area. So I think overall, I think COVID-19 did inspire some teachers to be more creative. And I think especially these types of NGOs, they have so much to offer. And maybe the National Teacher Training Program can take some of their ideas and incorporate it. I think that might be also another possible solution.
Yeah, for the China system, the whole country, this is something very proud by our minister of the Ministry of Education. But I think this is really amazing. This is a zero infected cases in our educational system, from the kindergarten to college. But now we are keep very highly alert about the coming tide of pandemic. But for our three guests, Professor Yong Zhao, have a question for all of you. Do you think there are any significant changes in education after schools went back? So please, Professor Wang Chuang, yeah, can you give us your observations and your thinking about this situation in Macau? Yeah.
And keep in mind, this is the question we're asking ourselves each week here.
Yes.
Really, we've been asking it over and over and over. Did anything change, or do people go back to the old ways?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. And I also want to just answer a little bit briefly about the previous question about how innovative education is taking place in China, such a highly centralized country. I want to say that maybe people, I understand where that question comes from, because we are in a highly centralized system. So people will think that to restrict people's freedom for innovation. I agree to some extent, but Chinese teachers do have freedom to have innovative pedagogies. For example, they have a goal. Of course, the previous guest mentioned we also have to help students prepare for the Gaokao. But teachers are free to be innovative in how they teach the content. For example, in mathematics, teachers are always encouraging students to come out with multiple solutions to a single question. There are many ways to solve a math problem. So I think even when I was a child, like 30 years ago, teachers were encouraging multiple solutions to a single question. We never focus on only a single answer to a question. But I understand there are some limitations that teachers cannot do. For example, you have to follow the principals, otherwise you have to do what you are told to do. But teacher training is a little bit easier in China because all teachers are required to participate in PD. I don't know, in the US, you have to give incentives. I work there too. You have to give teacher incentive for them to come to teacher workshop. But in China, you don't have to. They are required. They have to attend certain hours of PD each semester. So there are pros and cons in each system. So that's just I want to answer briefly. But the change is taking place after the pandemic. Well, we're still in the pandemic. After we come back to regular meetings, I would say that we miss each other. For example, University of Macau has been online teaching for a whole semester, and since January to almost 8 months, we haven't seen each other. We saw each other online, but now students are back. We feel that we are closer. But of course, we are still regulated. In Macau, students are still required to wear face masks, and they do very well. They mark the seats with signs. We still have to keep a social distance. So you cannot sit together. You have to leave a space open. So that's put a big challenge to the university because we do not have that many large classrooms. For example, if you have 50 students in a class, you have to use a classroom that can hold 100 students because you have to leave a seat open. So it's a challenge, but students and professors are all very happy to see each other. I think they value more the learning. They value more about the connections between teacher and students. As we all know that teaching profession is not simply giving knowledge to the students. Student and teacher interactions and relationships are very important. So what changes I see is the relationship between teacher and students become even better.
Yeah.
And the students, they all like each other. They all feel very happy. I think they're learning, and our course enrollment has gone historically high because many students maybe they dropped courses during online learning. They all want to come back. So every classroom is full, and we have quite a lot of students on the waiting list. So that's just I want to share. I want to give other guests.
Yeah. And Ouyang, what would your insights? Anything change? Will change?
Not insight, just my 2 cents. Honestly, I'm not trained as an educator, so I used to work in many other industries. So I would say education is a relatively slow and a conservative area. I would be naive to say one pandemic will change a lot of things in one time. It's gonna take a while, and actually, especially when everything's getting back to normal, like what happened in China, you can say everything's really getting back to normal. But one thing I would say, like here I can say a lot of questions about the centralized system, which is true. Actually, this pandemic didn't or doesn't show us like a decentralized possibility. It's another way. It shows people actually the centralized control works. But what I want to say here is, China is really big and complicated. So if you really want to understand China, you need to not just watch what happened on the top, you also need to down to the earth to look what's happening in the classrooms, which would surprise you a lot. So that's also the reason we keep continuing to contact with Chinese teachers and educators, even education bureau officers. When you talk to them something in details, not just big terms, I would say there are people, they would understand what's really good for them. And especially education is about, their kids. They will be quite serious. Big turns only work in another world. So, so what I want to say here, because we have a lot of American fellows here, I would really encourage people say, when we try to understand China, we should keep in mind, say, we need to also watch what's happening on the daily basis and in the every classroom. Otherwise, we pretty much will make the mistake, which is the policy people is making right now. Thank you.
Okay, Cody?
Yeah, I really agree with the other two speakers. I think they make some really great points. I talked to this, one principal, and he basically told me, because we interviewed a bunch of different principals last month, about 90 principals and also a mix of parents. And one principal said, the kids actually are kind of scared of using technology. Now everybody wants to go back to normal, and they don't want to be trying anything new post COVID-19 right now, because what's important is connection, and that's what is such a central part of education. And I totally agree about that. The question is, how can we use, make sure that teachers have that opportunity to have personalized connections with students, while at the same time, finding a way to connect them with some of the potential opportunities. I'm not saying that any ed tech, is very clearly effective, because none is, to be honest. We see adaptive learning as being possibly effective, but we really don't know what's about adaptive learning is effective and in what context. It could be very across different local contexts, different schools even. So there needs to be more research. But I think the question is, how can we enable rural teachers or teachers in general, not only in China but around the world? How can we allow them to give them the confidence and the skills to create those connections with students, while at the same time finding a way that technology can reach those students in other ways? Because teacher training is definitely going to be a component that we want to focus on, but it may not be, I think it may be helped with technology, and technology may be able to, like Squirrel AI, for instance. I was recently reading an article, I think Chris was actually quoted in several times, about Squirrel AI and how it can basically it claims to be more effective than a one-on-one tutor, which has been shown to be make some of the greatest impacts on education. Well, is that actually true? I think more testing needs to be done. So I think combining effective teacher training to make learning more personalized with maybe technology, maybe AI, maybe different parts of technology in different countries, to supplement the more teaching at the right level and those gaps. And then ultimately seeing what's cost effective for each country in terms of training, as well as the technology, and finding how can we allow teachers, how can we bring it to teachers to find a way to integrate it into their own lifestyles, which I think low floor, high ceiling, you guys have talked about in the past as well. We want to have that kind of opportunity open for teachers as well, finding out how to actually make it work in each school and for each student.
Yeah, Professor Wang, I think you have one final point to make. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chen. I think we missed the one point that I really want to share with you about that. Since I'm Chinese and I've been here for a long time, I grew up here too. So I feel that we all talk about teacher education, and we also talk about the learning and the teaching. There's one thing that I think we miss is the parental support. I think parental support is very, very high in China. So to give you some examples, during the pandemic, when the Chinese education turned into online teaching immediately without any preparation, the parents were not ready either. So I know a lot of parents who were not very well educated, who were not technology savvy. They spent a lot of time supporting their children, like K through 12 children, doing homeworks, uploading the homework to the teacher. So I think this is something the US is missing. The US parents would complain immediately if you ask them to help their children with their homework. So that's something I want to mention, that I think that's why Chinese education can do better because of the parental support. Thank you. That's just my last comment.
Thank you. Kurt? I think it's your time to introduce the next episode.
I want to thank all the people and all the comments and the audience as well. It's been a real delight catching up on what's been happening since you've solved the pandemic, maybe, and what the future holds. We have another exciting show next week because we stay with Asia. We have Southeast Asia, 4 different countries: the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. Not only the countries, but we have people who are the leaders. In fact, they're all listed in the top leaders in Southeast Asia on any list you would find. We have the former rector of the OpenU of Terbuka, which is basically OpenU of Indonesia, that any data shows between 600,000 and 800,000 students. We have Tian Belawati, who started out the very first, when it's opened, to become the rector and also the past president of the Asian Association of Open Universities. The current president of Asian Open University Association is Melinda Bandalaria from the Philippines, who also is the chancellor of the Open U of the Philippines. She also started at the lowest, just kind of a marker all the way up to the top. And then we have my old friend Zaraini Wati Abbas, who was at the Open U of Malaysia when it started with nobody and went up to 100,000 people, and now is at Warasan University in Penang. She moved from KL over to Penang and is an international leader, as are the others. And she's written tons on the topic. And then in Thailand, we have the director and the deputy director of Thailand Cyber University, Tapani Tamanter and Jintavi, whose last name I won't pronounce for you, but you can see it in the blog post. 3 of them have chapters in my recent MOOCs and Open Ed in the Global South, and Zaraini has a couple chapters in others in my book. You'll be amazed with what they know. We're going to try and make it fast paced because there's so much that catching up I need to do with all of them, but the whole world needs to do and learn from them and hear what's happening in a very select way. We have 5 people, 4 countries next week, so that's a lot. Read the blog post, please, so we can start with that. We'll start with the assumption that you know who these people are, and we'll briefly touch on their background. So thanks for all this week. Chang-A and Chris, would you like to do a final thank you? And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.